Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first day of CEDA's Economic and Political Outlook 2021. My name is Jared Ball and I am the Chief Economist of CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. Committed to recognition and reconciliation, we respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. You might be wondering about what you can do to turn these sorts of words into action to advance reconciliation in 2021. I would recommend Reconciliation Australia's 2021 State of Reconciliation in Australia report, which provides some important inspiration to move from safe to brave. In short, we must all be willing to confront our own personal biases along with overt and covert racism in our community, starting with people in our own sphere of influence. The work that CEDA does is possible through the incredible support of our members. And to that end, I would like to acknowledge the sponsors of today's live stream, Griffith Business School, and thank them for their ongoing support. Thanks also to CEDA trustees who I know are joining us around the country for special viewings of the EPO today. This is now actually the 40th year of CEDA's Economic and Political Outlook, an annual ritual which I'm glad to say remains unbroken, even in the face of a global pandemic. If you haven't done so already, I'd urge you to jump on the CEDA website, ceda.com.au, and download the Economic and Political Outlook publication. It includes analysis of the domestic economic outlook with NAB Chief Economist Alan Oster, who's joining us today, the International Economic Outlook by Chief Economist and Head of Research at ANZ, Richard Yetsenga, the Political Outlook with the AFR's political editor, Phil Curry, and the Domestic Policy Outlook by CEDA's own senior economist, Cassandra Windsor. Later today, you'll hear from an expert panel on the Domestic Political Outlook with Phil Curry, Laura Jays, Fran Kelly, and Peter Van Onselen. And tomorrow, we'll have an address with Australia's Ambassador to the United States, the Honourable Arthur Sinodinos AO, followed by an expert panel on the International Outlook. But first up today, we're going to get into what is happening with the domestic economy. Australia's economic recovery seems to be gathering pace, but if the first 2 months of 2021 have taught us anything, it's that the aftershocks of COVID-19 and its legacies will be with us for some time yet. How confident can we be that better days lie ahead and that the recovery that is underway won't be derailed? To answer these questions and more, I'm joined by EPO contributor and NAB Chief Economist Alan Oster and Nikki Hutley, economist at Social Outcomes. Please jump in and join the conversation on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is hashtag EPO 2021, and tagging CEDA at CEDA_news. Today, like at all our public events, you still will be able to interact with our speakers through the Q&A portal, which is either available via the link below the video on your screen, or you can enter details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode EPO 2021. We've got about 35 minutes for the discussion, so please get into Pigeonhole and get your questions ready. But while you do that, I'm going to kick off and direct a question to you, Alan. You've written what I would say is quite an upbeat assessment of the economy in your contribution to the EPO. We've seen that consumer confidence has been incredibly resilient despite what has happened in the last 12 months. What are you seeing in 2021? And I guess, how do you reconcile some of these things that we're seeing in consumer confidence, particularly in a year where we are going to see above trend growth, but we can clearly see that that is not going to translate into higher wages, at least in the short to medium term. So what are you seeing in 2021, and how do you reconcile some of those different trends?
Well, I think when we look at the economy, number one, we're going to make a couple of assumptions. Assumption number one is that we don't get another serious outbreak of the virus locally. We're assuming that essentially half the population gets a vaccine by the middle of the year and everybody by the end of the year. And then we look at our own data. Our business surveys are saying all the key measures, confidence, business conditions, forward orders, all are above long run average. And then we look at our own internal data through NAB, and we see essentially total consumption is still up 4% or 5% vis-a-vis this time last year, in retail even stronger. We're also seeing, in terms of the business bank, that revenue coming into business customers are basically up about 14%, and very little is dependent on JobKeeper. And so what do we see going forward? We see essentially maybe not as strong growth in the March quarter, because you have a few things like Victoria, etc., but still reasonable, and then accelerating growth. So overall, we expect GDP to be up about 4% this year. Now, that might sound really good, but it still means that unemployment's probably around 6% by the end of this year. We think the economy will probably continue to go above trend, say around 3, 2.8 sort of thing year after that. But even then, you're still back to an unemployment rate around 5.5. So I think it's a great snapback. The damage that was done to Australia's economy was much less than we all feared. But the reality is this is a deflationary shock. We're not getting much increases in wages. Inflation will be really low. The Reserve Bank's saying, look, we're not increasing rates now until the middle of 24 at the earliest, and previously it was end 23. We have a lot of sympathy to that. And in the article, we're saying, look, let's assume the virus didn't happen and the economy just grew at trend. We won't catch up to that trend growth rate until about 24 to 25. So, yes, it's great that we've recovered so quickly. And in the medium term, I think there's a lot of encouraging things for the Australian economy. You know, it's a great place to live, to work, to invest, compared to what's happening offshore. But there's still challenges. And there are parts of the economy, we look at things like accommodation, food services, education, anything that's got a lot to do with international travel, etc. They're doing it really tough. And I think the government, they'll withdraw JobKeeper, but they have to have additional support. And I think the big issue now is to, having saved the economy, if you like, now we're trying to make it grow even faster. And that, I think, is mainly a thing for essentially the fiscal policy. RBA is sort of saying we're going to keep things going as fast as we possibly can, because there's no way we're going to get 2 to 3% inflation anytime soon. So I think it's a package that still needs to be, the economy still needs a support, is what I'm really saying. But we're doing so much better than we previously thought we were going to do.
Nikki, just picking up on Alan's point there around the need for further support in the economy. Obviously, a lot of economists have pointed to the success of the stimulus that we've seen recently, but also this balancing act that we'll have in 2021 around some of that stimulus coming off, but the potential need for further support in the economy. How well do you think we've done on the stimulus front? And do you think that we need to do more, particularly when Alan's talking about, you know, the kind of pace at which the unemployment rate is going to come down, and some of those sectors that are still going to continue to struggle in 2021?
Yeah, so my thought is that at the moment we're possibly focusing a little bit too much on the silver lining and perhaps ignoring the still large cloud that hangs over the economy. It certainly doesn't take much, as we've seen with Victoria, for us to hit another bump in the road. And while we might have avoided or gone past the worst economic impacts, we've certainly got lingering ones to come. I think the government did a great job. But in focusing so much on JobKeeper and then the Job Seeker Supplement, there's this expression, you know, Australia is a great manager of adversity and a terrible manager of prosperity. I think that we possibly haven't managed the adversity as well as we could, in the sense that, yes, we got the stimulus out there very quickly, avoided some of the worst impacts, but we haven't really looked at this as an opportunity for really long-term change and the policies that could come. And now you could argue, well, the government was just busy dealing with the emergency in the first 12 months. And so what I hope we will see is more of that long-term look at some of the really big policy issues that can be, where we can use stimulus to drive significant reform. And I'm thinking about things, obviously I'm going to mention climate change, it's something close to my heart, but even things about childcare report, great report from Equity Economics out this week on paid parental leave for both partners, what we might do there and the economic gains. So looking at, was it 7 years ago now when Glenn Stevens talked about the Productivity Commission's to-do list, which of course is figurative rather than literal, but there's still a lot of reforms we could do. And I guess that's where I'd like to see the focus in 2021 is thinking about, all right, we've got past the worst of the crisis, as Alan said, still sectors that need a lot of help. So how can we think about transitioning some of those people who will permanently lose their jobs? And the idea that we can sail through the end of JobKeeper, the end of the job seeker supplement with no impact on the economy, I think is very naive. We will hit a reasonable bump. There's still 1.5 million people on JobKeeper. So even if a very small percentage of those were to lose those jobs, it's still significant numbers in terms of unemployment. So lots more work on the fiscal front, as Alan said. And I'd just like to see that a lot more directed at broader, long-term sustainable policy.
So let me at this point just remind people about Pigeonhole and putting in some questions. CEDA.pigeonhole.at using the passcode EPO 2021 or via the link below your video screen. I haven't seen any questions pop up yet, but I've got an eagle eye on it and we'll be ready to ask those questions. So please bring them in. Nikki's raised a really interesting point, I think, around sort of the long-term economic vision and some of those structural problems that were with us pre-COVID. And certainly a message when CEDA released this report today around the fact that we were bold and brave in some of the policy decisions we made in 2020 and we should be going forward. It's also something, Alan, that you've picked up on towards the end of your EPO contribution, just around some of these things that you'd like to see longer term to sort of build the productive capacity of the economy. What's kind of on your kind of top list of things to do in terms of this longer term picture?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is let's not withdraw the stimulus too quickly, because Nikki's right. There are sectors that are seriously in deep trouble. So accommodation, food, commercial property, all those sort of things are still really difficult. I would like to see more focus on what I might call infrastructure and telecommunications. I'd like to see some focus on things that are important. So make us competitive, and that includes climate change. So you need to spend some money there. And I think the other thing, it's one of the great lessons out of the last 12 months, is that we need more reliable supply chains. So, we've always said, well, let's have the cheapest, normally out of China, and that's fine. Now I think we need to do things like medical manufacturing, things that we've got specialties in, so agri is very strong. I think also you've got issues like mining that's still strong, and there I think there's a medium-term objective that we have to diversify away from purely China. Now, if China could figure out a neat way of getting rid of our iron ore, I'm sure they would, but they can't. And in the meantime, sort of when people ask me, well, what's China done to our big term economy? The answer is nothing, because iron ore has offset everything else they've done elsewhere. But, at the end of the day, you've got to diversify. You've got to build more of your own and essentially try and there are some hard issues out there. I think reducing, obviously, red tape, industrial relations, anything you can do there. The problem is, I suspect, as you get into harder things, politics comes in, and then it becomes very difficult to actually help. And I think we're already starting to see that. So for me, it's got to be building better supply chains, using your infrastructure to spend, lots of digital focus, climate change, get the most competitive cost of energy. That's really important. And then just keep doing anything that makes us more competitive, and that's a huge microeconomic reform agenda.
Well, I'm sure that our panel later today will have a lot more to say about the politics of reform and the difficulties there. We do have some questions coming through from Pigeonhole, including one that I'll direct your way, Nikki, from Adelaide, and I assume it's from the Adelaide audience, potentially the trustees sitting in the room. And their question really goes to issues around inequality, I think, being exacerbated through this crisis. The question is, as individual stimulus support reduces, do you expect further problems being reinforced with our U-shaped economy, where the poor stay poor and wealth increases for those who already have it? What are you seeing in terms of those trends, Nikki? And I will allude to the fact that Richard Yetsinger's piece in the EPO does go to this point around the exacerbation of inequality across many countries globally in the last 12 months.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Jared. There's a plethora of new literature and studies coming through on the impacts of COVID on inequality across the globe, and the outcomes look pretty dire. In Australia, we saw immediately in the first wave and lockdowns that went right across the country, we did see total disparity. There were more women laid off, the very young, the older, migrant workers, particularly those who were casual workers, and more likely lower income workers anyway. So we did see disparate effects. Some of those, as we've recovered 90% of the jobs lost so far, we've seen that come back a reasonable way. So that's been a bit addressed. What I think has been the two key issues that stand out for me, one, of course, is something that I've advocated for a long time, which is the permanent increase in Newstart. Clearly, that actually had the opposite effect by having, or job seeker as it's now called, the coronavirus supplement had the opposite effect in Australia, of course, of actually helping reduce inequality. We saw, tremendous benefits to so many families and individuals who could afford, the 3 square meals and all of these anecdotal stories that you hear right across people. It's not anecdotes, it's real. The fact that people could afford decent healthcare, a second pair of, shoes for their kids, all of these things made a massive difference. And we saw from the data from the likes of Ilion, for example, that money was being directly spent, which is what we economists have been saying for a long time. Low-income households need to spend the money, so it's a great stimulus effect. If you take that away, we are going to see a huge number of people back into, significant disadvantage. And I, think there is basically such widespread support for permanently increasing the rate, including from CEDA, has come out and supported it. But, the Business Council, even some conservative politicians have supported this. The government really is the last line. The second thing, which hasn't got as much attention, is around housing affordability. And we've seen, forecasts are increasing for where house prices are going this year and next. Contrary to what many of us expected at the start of last year, house prices have held firm. In some areas, they've gone much more quickly ahead, and particularly house prices as opposed to apartment prices. We had a significant problem. We have had for over a decade in this country. Sydney is one of the most unaffordable cities in the world. Melbourne and Brisbane are not as bad, but still not particularly affordable. We need to address this problem. We are entrenching inequality by virtue of the fact that many kids now, the only way they can get into the market is if their parents are wealthy enough to forward them and to support them with a deposit, and therefore re-entrenching inequality. So there are a number of issues, as Alan and I were talking about before, all of these reform policies, there's so many things that the government could do and so many things that I'd like to see on their policy reform agenda in the year ahead. And it can all be neatly tied in, not with stimulus in the short term, but also long-term reform to make people better.
And maybe we could just stick with housing for just a minute, because we have had a question from Anonymous. Anonymous seems to be asking a lot of questions today and every day in these live streams. But the question has been asked, given the heat that we're seeing in the housing market, should regulators be stepping in to cool down the market? And we have seen some moves to that effect in New Zealand. Quick perspective first from you, Nikki, and then Alan on the question of whether we are likely or need to see that sort of intervention in the market?
It's a very tricky one because obviously the Reserve Bank needs to keep interest rates low and has said they're going to do it for at least 3 years, and that sends a definite signal to the market. We've had a lot of support for first home buyers with grants to help stimulate the economy, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we know that that can add heat to the market, and it certainly appears to have been the case as we see record numbers of first home buyers coming back in. But that's the part of the market we want to see activated. I think on the macroprudential front, from my perspective, it's quite hard for us to see. I'm not entirely sure that New Zealand's got it right on this one, particularly by, you want to have sensible levels of loan-to-value ratios so that you don't see risky lending. But I think Australia's really got the settings pretty well. We're not seeing as much foreign investment as we were. This is pent-up domestic demand, and I suspect that, it's far more about planning policies, getting rid of NIMBYism, which understandably are long-term policies, and then in the meantime dealing with more affordable and social housing, and again using stimulus measures to support that part of the economy until we get it right, because this isn't a problem that's going to be solved overnight.
Alan?
I don't think we're anywhere near New Zealand. So we own BNZ, and that is really very, very hot markets out there. And what the central bank over there has done is for investor loans, they've said we're going to put limits on loan to valuation ratios, which is one way to do it, because you can't sort of do the issue of I'm going to increase rates to try and slow the housing markets. That's just not possible at present. The other, and I think Nikki's right, that you've got a wealth effect that is helping the economy at present. And so you don't really want to kill that. For what it's worth, I think it's really interesting at present. What we're not seeing is these affordability issues essentially being driven by debt. So if you're looking at housing credit, it's not increasing very much. The only parts that are increasing are actually the owner-occupiers. And most people are paying off debt as if interest rates hadn't changed. And so the amortisation of the book is sort of offsetting the growth in housing credit. So for me, I think we can keep going the way we are. But I'd go back to what Nikki was saying. I don't think there's very many economists out there that think the dole should go back to the used up levels. I think you need to keep it up. And from what I'm reading in the newspaper, and that's all I'm doing, it sounds like the government's a little bit more sympathetic to that, because it's very important that you bring everybody with you. And if you don't, then you just cause problems. And I think you can go back and look at some of, for the last 20 odd years, the middle class around the OECD didn't get any pay rise in real terms. And so that's why you get Trump, you get Brexit, you get all those sort of, in Eastern Europe and in Europe, some of the extreme right comes up. So you've got to bring people with you. And I think that's, to get that, if nothing else, the one thing I'd want would be essentially that the job seeker doesn't disappear in terms of supplements.
Absolutely, Alan, and I think it's not often that economists agree on things. This seems to be something that economists are agreeing on, which should say a lot. I'll stick with you for a minute, Alan. We've got a question from Daniel Kenny, who's asking about the risks of the kind of downturn that we're seeing in the US and UK, and also that issue around the relationship with China and what impact that is going to have domestically. I guess one of the really interesting things is that we see in some of the ABS business surveys that business, when they talk about why they're not investing more, are often talking about the global economic conditions and uncertainty. What impact do you think what we're seeing globally, and obviously countries that are much more impacted by COVID than we have been, how's that going to impact on domestic sentiment?
Well, to be brutally honest, at this stage, what's happening offshore is reflecting the fact that they haven't really got the virus under control. And so, the recent data you had out of Japan, Europe, UK has been a bit better than we all thought, but it's all losing momentum. And in the States, you can see it in the labour market, it's losing momentum. But then Biden's come up with 9% of GDP as a package to try and keep that going. So to me, The international environment, yeah, there's a lot of lumps and bumps, but we're not seeing the sort of slowdown that we've seen offshore. The question about business investment, however, is really important. We're seeing a lot of signs that, things are still fine in terms of consumption. The government's still spending a lot of money, but we're not seeing any sign at all that business investment is picking up. Now, we're the largest business bank. We should be seeing it. We're not seeing it. Like the Reserve Bank, we're hoping that it might turn around at the middle of the year. A lot of the government's policies, like the instant asset write-off, are based on the idea that investment's going to get going. And if you think about it, the economy's turned around and business investment's still going backwards. So the ratio of business investment to GDP is probably the 30-year low. So we really do have to try and encourage. The good news is confidence is high. When you ask them about are they going to invest going forward, in our surveys anyway, they're giving us really good ratings, but there's no rubber hitting the road. And so that, to me, is a really important issue. And I don't know whether they'll be able to do anything in the budget or not, but I don't think it's got a lot to do with the global outlook. If you can get a vaccine, hopefully you might make business feel a lot happier, and some of the economies, the parts of the economy that are really struggling might get a bit of a boost if we can start to have everybody vaccinated in the way you go.
So one of these areas that we certainly want to see more investment in is around alternative sources of energy. Nikki, I'm going to package up two kind of questions from Anonymous sitting on Pigeonhole, which is what opportunities do you see for Australia in terms of developing alternative energy sources around hydrogen and so forth, but also more fundamentally what you would like to see done to address climate change in this country?
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, so the Climate Council put out later last year a clean jobs plan, which had 76,000 jobs created from 12 core opportunities. All of those opportunities were based on things that are already, basically shovel ready. So around both city scale and community grid scale solar and wind farms. We've got the renewable energy zones, not just in the Orana area in New South Wales, but also Queensland, now Victoria. So we're getting ready. And not only do these things, stimulate jobs, but actually for every dollar that's invested, the modelling done by Alphabeta suggested that you get $2 to $3, possibly even $4 of private sector investment for the projects that are there. I think the green hydrogen is a little bit more problematic. People are waving hydrogen around now as though it's a bit of a silver bullet, and gosh, it would be amazing if we can get the technology up and proven. But at the moment, it's a bit like carbon capture and storage. It's not proven at commercial scale. It's not yet financially feasible. CCS is probably never going to get up in terms of financial feasibility. Green hydrogen, and it has to be green, is the biggest opportunity. So investing in more research, pilot scale development is where there's opportunity for the government, and they should be doing this in areas where it's linked to manufacturing capability or manufacturing precincts, so that the big manufacturers, including new manufacturers in potential industries like we talk about green steel, so that we make sure that that's all nicely aligned. We do need to have more investment in the grid infrastructure. Alan referred to infrastructure needs before, and that's, we've put a lot truckload, pun intended, into road and rail, but less so into tech, communications, and also into our power grid. So that's where we need to spend the money. But there are plenty of opportunities there, and this is going to be great stimulus, and not just stimulus for now to get us out of this hole, but stuff that's going to, Alan was talking about diversifying the economy. This is exactly all of the boxes ticked by having this type of investment. It's not throwing good money away. It's investing in long-term as well as short-term economic stimulus, new activity, new jobs, and a more sustainable economy. So, ticks every box.
Thanks, Nikki. I'm conscious of time. We've probably got about 10 minutes to go, so I'm going to try and get around the country a little bit, particularly some of these questions that I am assuming are coming in from the trustee events, and certainly from Ricky from ACU, who I am thinking is in Sydney. And Alan, he's asked about how the tourism sector can adapt given the international border restrictions and also some of the things that we've seen on state border restrictions. Now, we've seen from the international projections that international air traffic is not to get back to kind of pre-COVID till at least 2024, if not a bit longer. Yeah. We know that the kind of interstate travel, as much as people should holiday at home more, it's not quite the same as international travellers who come and stay longer and spend more. What do you think the tourism sector is going to have to do to adapt in coming years to get through this period?
Well, the one good thing you can say about Australia is that for every foreign tourist that comes here, 3 Australians go overseas. So if you're just talking about tourism, you've got to basically encourage the local tourism. And it's really important that we sort of don't shut the borders very often or make people feel nervous. But if you can diversify away from the international to the local, that's really important. And I think if you look around Australia, you look at Western Australia, even Queensland now, they're getting really good tourism from locals. The other thing that happens is people then give up and they just spend more in the shop, so you get a switch that way. But I think you've got to try and cater for the local tourists. International, it's really difficult. I think you've just got to wait for a vaccine, which is 2023, and that causes problems in some other areas as well, like hospitality, and particularly accommodation. So if you're in the CBD in Melbourne, on our data, they're doing about or less than half of what hospitality and accommodation was doing 12 months ago. So you've got to sort of diversify as much as you can to cater to local tourism. Now, that's not going to help you much. It's not going to help you if you're an international airline, but maybe you change that to more domestic flights, because that's where the tourism dollar is. It doesn't help you in tourism. It doesn't help you in education, where a lot of students that were coming would actually get into the tourism market. But the locals can actually help a lot by going. And that's one of the unfortunate effects sitting in Melbourne, lockdown. I mean, I think one of the issues that I'll be sitting about thinking, was we were thinking of going, we'll go up to Brisbane, we'll go to the West Bay, now thinking, well, we might just go to the local Daylesford or somewhere within the state. I think that's a bit of an issue, but it's more about diversifying and attracting locals, be they from your state or from interstate.
So just shifting from, I guess, the short-term migration that we see in tourism to the longer-term migration and the contribution that has made to population growth. Nikki, we've got a question from Andre in Perth, who wants to know how do we see migration as a potential tool to stimulate the economy by growing the population, bringing international students and qualified workers to support economic growth. Obviously, we've seen a big kind of drop. We're seeing, I think, the lowest population growth since 1916-17. Do you see this as part of the recovery that we need to be quite strategic and calibrated about how we get our migration system back up and running?
Yeah, so the 3 Ps of economic growth, population, participation and productivity, you need to be a little bit careful about relying purely on population growth to support the economy. Obviously, it has been an important part of Australia's growth story, but it doesn't lead to an increase in GDP per capita, and that's where the productivity and the participation rates come in. What we would like to see is, skilled migration. I mean, there are a lot of firms that are calling out at the moment saying they cannot find people with the right skills across a range of industries in this country, and a significant part of that is because people cannot get here. We rely very significantly on foreign workers in all sorts of areas of skills, not just to pick fruit. And you just need to have a look at the price of berries at the moment to see that there's certainly an impact there in not having enough workers in the country. So I would like to see that we do use a careful targeting of migration, as well as humanitarian, of course, is a very important part of that equation, but also making sure that we get the right skills into the country. I mean, of course, people can't come in, but people also then have, much like the tourism story Alan was talking about, people haven't been able to leave as well. So we've had less of a brain drain, which I guess is helps on one side of the equation. But we do need to access the skills that the global labour market has to offer, and that's very important for us. It may be, though, that, with working from home, with people being more flexible, with everyone being Zooming as we are now and on Teams and every other app that there is, that maybe that allows us to have people working remotely rather than necessarily having to live in the country. We've seen this, of course, with international students, some going online, but we know that close to 40%, I think, of the value of international students comes from all the extra expenditure that they have when they're here, whether it's accommodation and going out, to eat, etc. It's not just the education fees. So it's important to have people come to the country. It's an important part of building, global cities, to have lots of international citizens there mixing. So it's going to be interesting to see how we manage that challenge in the year ahead. But, it should certainly be part of the growth story, but, not just get more people in would be my view.
I guess another part of the growth story, we've talked a lot about federal-based stimulus today, but there is another question from Anonymous talking about the role of states and territories this year. Last year, we saw particularly New South Wales and Victoria really leverage up and go for growth in terms of new infrastructure projects. We've seen a little bit of bold reform in terms of the switch from stamp duty to land tax. What would you like to see, or what would you expect to see from state and territory governments in terms of some of the levers that they'll pull this year in terms of keeping the recovery on track, Alan?
It's really hard. I mean, obviously, they've got a lot of infrastructure they still need to build. So I would vote very strongly for let's accelerate that. I do like the idea of land tax rather than stamp duty. It'd be interesting to see if New South Wales actually gets that up. We've always thought in the past that would be too expensive, but maybe now it's got a funny situation that, who cares about the budget? We'll just sort of do some long-term stuff that's going to be good over the long run. And so that I think is also worth looking at. But, just simple things like, surely one of the things we were looking at early on was, if it takes you 12 months to get something approved through state governments, why can't you just pass a law that says it's now 6 months? Or if it was 2 years, it's 12 months. So you try and focus on getting things done quicker. That's what I really like to see. But, infrastructure, I think, accelerate what you've got. And, there's also lots of things like, it's not very sexy, but repair and maintenance is really important. That's sort of stuff.
So it's a good point.
Sorry, Joe, I was just going to say, I think we've seen a lot of that. I actually would congratulate state governments. I think they are spending money in good areas. There is green infrastructure and green spending. There is stuff around greater gender equity through grant programs. I mean, if we look at the split between the fiscal stimulus between state and federal, we've never seen state spending so high as a percent of GDP. They really are more than carrying their weight. So I think they're to be congratulated, and they're doing it in ways, including in New South Wales and especially Victoria, around affordable social housing. So they're doing stimulus in the way that I'd like to see it more broadly rolled out and supported by the federal government.
Yeah, can I just come back in and say that I think public housing is really important, because there's a lot of vacant CBD properties that are going to always be vacant. So, convert them into public housing. I mean, that also gets people employed very quickly in the construction industry, which is still the worst performing of all the sectors that we're looking at. So I really strongly agree with public housing.
Well, we are running out of time. We do have 5 minutes left, but I would like to ask each of you just about the kind of swing factor that you're looking at in 2021. Obviously, we had a massive wild card in 2020 that came our way in the form of COVID-19. Is there an economic indicator or a market or something that you will be watching really carefully this year in terms of assessing whether things might go much better or much worse than forecast? Alan, starting with you.
Yeah, well, honest answer is we don't know what the next thing is. We hope that the vaccine works and we don't get any other problems. What we're looking at incredibly hard these days is our own data. So we're trying to find real-time data. So we can look, and I'm sure all the other banks can do this as well. So every Wednesday, I can see every electronic transaction that occurred for the week ending the previous Saturday. So we're 3 days out of it. And so we can actually see what's happening live. And so I'll keep watching that. In the meantime, I'm just praying that the vaccine works and that we don't get further outbreaks, because what's essentially happened is you had to close down the economy because of health reasons, and we don't want that to happen again. And if it doesn't, as we reopen, then that'll be really important in terms of keeping the recovery going.
I think that's not bad advice, Alan. Crossing fingers, praying for the vaccine. Yeah. That's probably something that economists can do. Nikki, your perspectives on this one?
Yeah, so obviously, first and foremost, we've got to be looking at the health situation. Are there outbreaks? How quickly and effectively is the vaccine being rolled out? As Alan said, health is primary for everybody, because that's the key driver of how quickly we get out of this mess. In terms of how we're doing when we're not in lockdown, this year has been, or 2020 was amazing for the amount of data, new data series that we got. We all started looking at Open Table and at Google Mobility, and these plethora of the credit card data that the banks are sharing with us, and microtransactions from Ilion. So we've got a lot more real-time data. Even the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in giving us forward indicators for the preliminary measures for things like employment and retail sales, really helping us to get much more on-time data, so we can see where that's at. It would be great if we could get sort of more updates on things like the JobKeeper would have been helpful as well. But I guess that's about to go out the door. I think the thing that I'll be looking at most, though, is geopolitics. Trump is gone for the moment, but what we saw on the 6th of January really concerned me. And, there is around the world, as people are struggling with the virus and lockdowns, they're struggling with the economic implications. Whilst in Australia, we're relatively in this bubble, around the world, we're seeing an awful lot of unrest and demonstrations. And if the world goes that way, whether it's Russia or the US or China, all of these do have implications for Australia. Clearly, the relationship with China, you alluded to earlier, is going to be incredibly important. How quickly can we diversify away from that? So I think, health, lots of data, geopolitics is where I'll be looking at lots of things.
Well, thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Alan, for sharing your insights today. We have come to time. These things always fly by pretty quickly. I'd also like to thank our live stream sponsor, Griffith Business School. Your ongoing support means a lot in terms of these discussions and the quality of debate on key policy issues that we can have. I'd also like to thank the audience, including the trustees in and at events around the country, for coming along and listening to today's discussion, which has been recorded and will be available on the CEDA website, ceda.com.au. You can keep up to date on our program. Plenty of events coming up. Make sure you jump on the web and register, including Rod Sims talking about the ACCC's enforcement and compliance policy update for this year on the 23rd of February. Next up, we'll have the political outlook, and don't forget about day 2, where we'll go global starting with the Australian Ambassador to the United States, Arthur Denis, AO. And we're now going to have a 5-minute interval, but feel free to continue the conversation by connecting with CEDA via LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, you name it. Continue the conversation there. Thanks, everyone.